The sun hovered low over the plains of Mesopotamia, casting a golden hue across the vast expanse of land that stretched from horizon to horizon. The mighty Euphrates glimmered like a ribbon of bronze in the fading light, its gentle current flowing silently past ancient reeds and clay embankments. This was the end of another day in Babylon, the city of gardens and gods, ziggurats and wisdom, a place where the hum of daily life softened into sacred stillness. As evening descended, within the quieter quarter of the city, just past the artisan streets and olive markets, lay a modest home built of sun-baked mud bricks. The home stood close to the outer canal, surrounded by tamarisk trees and flowering shrubs. Smoke curled gently from a small clay chimney, rising like incense into the sky now brushed in warm pinks and lavenders. Inside, a scribe named Nabzeri moved slowly about his home, completing the gentle tasks of twilight. He was not a man of great renown nor of immense fortune, but he was content. His days were filled with careful script etched into clay, and his evenings with reflection and rest. Tonight, like so many before, he sought only the quiet comfort of routine, of the familiar sounds of the city unwinding, the slow rhythm of lamps being lit, of feet brushing across woven mats, of the breeze whispering through the reeds. Nabzeri stood by the open doorway, gazing out toward the river's edge. The last light of the sun caught the towers of Babylon in the distance, turning the tops of temples and terraces into silhouettes of old stories, stories of kings and stars, of old gods whose names still carried weight in the hush of prayer. Yet here, away from the ceremonial chants and the bustle of merchants, there was only the faint sound of lutes from a nearby courtyard and the cooing of doves settling into their nests. He turned inward, stepping barefoot across the smooth clay floor of his home. In the center, an oil lamp flickered, casting soft shadows that danced upon the walls. Its flame, fed by pressed sesame oil, gave off a light neither harsh nor dim, just enough to illuminate the low shelf of clay tablets he had carefully stacked over the years. Nabzeri crouched beside them and selected one of the older tablets, a personal piece written long ago when the city still pulsed with the ambition of younger kings. The cuneiform etched into it was delicate, firm, his own hand from a decade prior. He read it slowly, not aloud, but with his eyes letting the remembered words settle over him like a familiar breeze. In the stillness, we find the voice of time. The reed does not rush to grow, and yet it becomes tall. The star does not race across the sky, and yet it burns. He smiled faintly. He did not remember writing those words for any specific purpose. They had simply arrived one evening, as thoughts often did, rising from the rhythm of daily life, as natural and inevitable as the tide of the Euphrates. A gentle knock sounded at the side entrance. He rose and opened the small wooden gate, revealing his young apprentice, in Lillidan, a thoughtful boy with bright eyes and hands still clumsy with the stylus. "I've brought more clay, Master," the boy said, holding out a bundled cloth, filled with damp earth from the riverbank. "Come in," Nabzeri said kindly. Motioning to the low bench beside the work table, the boy entered quietly, removing his sandals and placing the cloth down with care. He was learning the art of quietness, not silence, but the practiced stillness that allowed the mind to listen to itself. "Today, I practiced the tablet for the temple," Lillidan said, sitting cross-legged, "but I smudged the last line. I tried to fix it, but it's all right," Nabzeri interrupted softly. "Learning to write is also learning to accept what the clay remembers." The boy nodded, his face calming. The scribe poured 2 small cups of barley tea, its aroma warm and lightly spiced. They drank without speaking for a while, letting the day dissolve around them. Outside, the sounds of the city softened further, a final cart rattling along the main road, the splash of someone drawing water from a nearby well, the low murmur of a family sharing their last meal beneath a pergola of woven reeds. As the stars began to bloom overhead, Nabzeri retrieved a fresh clay tablet and gently pressed it onto the smooth surface of the work table. He dipped the wooden stylus into water and passed it to the boy. "Tonight," he said gently, "you will write about stillness." Lillidan looked at him, curious. "What do I say?" "Only what you see," the scribe replied. "Only what you feel. Let the evening speak for itself." The boy lowered his eyes to the tablet and began to write, slowly, carefully. As the oil lamp flickered beside him, Nabzeri watched for a moment, then turned toward the open window. The moon had risen above the rooftops, and the night had fully arrived. The sky stretched endless above the city, a dark, velvet dome filled with constellations once mapped by priests and stargazers. From his seat, Nabzeri could just hear the Euphrates moving, its waters winding past the gardens and walls, carrying the voices of the past into the present. And here, in the quiet heart of Babylon, two scribes, one old, one young, etched small truths into clay, not for glory, not for kings, but simply because it was evening, and there was peace. As the evening deepened, and the stars settled more firmly into the velvet sky, Nabzeri gently rose from his spot near the window. The soft rustle of his linen robe brushed across the clay floor as he crossed the room to place a new stick of dried tamarisk into the small hearth. The fire within had long faded to embers, but it did not need to blaze, only to warm the edges of the room and scent the air with its woody breath. And Lillidan remained seated, carefully inscribing his lines into the moist clay. The stylus made no sound, yet Nabzeri could sense the rhythm of thought behind each stroke. It was not easy to teach writing, nor to learn it. Each mark had meaning, and each line demanded care. But the act itself, the deliberate creation of words, was as sacred as any hymn sung in the great temple of Marduk. Outside, the breeze returned. It slipped through the narrow clay windows, carrying the faint scent of river reeds and cool water. Somewhere in the distance, a flute played, soft, slow notes floating like feathers on the night air. Nabzeri listened for a moment, letting the sound fill the spaces between his thoughts. He had always loved this time, the pause between the day and the dream, when the world seemed to sigh and close its eyes without protest. He turned toward the shelves lining the far wall. They held not riches, but relics of a life steeped in quiet observation, small jars of pigment and ash, a few dried fig leaves, bundles of flattened reeds used for pressing, and scrolls made of palm bark tied with delicate string. He reached for a small wooden box and opened it with care. Inside, nestled in woven straw, was a delicate seal, a cylinder carved with the image of a shepherd kneeling beneath a crescent moon. He smiled as he turned it in his fingers. "That belonged to my grandfather," he said softly, though in Lillidan had not asked. He used it to mark the stories he kept for himself, not for kings, not for temples, just for memory. And Lillidan looked up from his writing. "Did he teach you to be a scribe?" "In a way," Nabzeri replied, his voice gentle. "He taught me to listen to the wind, to feel the weight of quiet things. That is what writing is, not just words, but listening." The boy nodded, understanding more than he could say. After a time, Nabzeri lit a second lamp. The room filled with a warmer glow, wrapping the walls in soft amber. He walked to the alcove beside the main room and unwrapped a simple evening meal: lentils seasoned with coriander, dried dates, and a small bowl of flatbread. He poured water into clay cups and placed everything on a low mat near the fire. And Lillidan set his tablet aside, carefully, reverently, and joined his teacher. They ate in silence, but it was the silence of companionship, not absence, the kind of silence that binds more than speech. Between bites, Nabzeri spoke in a quiet murmur. "There's something I've learned over the years in Lil. Babylon speaks even when no one listens. It's in the bricks, the canals, the shape of the stars. The past is never lost, it only waits." The boy looked up, chewing thoughtfully. "Waits for what?" "For someone to notice," the old scribe replied. "For someone like you." They smiled at each other, and the moment lingered like an ember before sleep later. After the meal was finished and the fire was lowered to a glow, and Lillidan curled up beneath a woven blanket on a straw mat near the hearth, Nabzeri walked once more to the window, his silhouette outlined by the gentle flicker of lamplight. The sky above Babylon was vast and ancient, filled with stars that bore the names of gods and stories. The great twins of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, the bull of heaven, the scales of justice. Nabzeri traced them with his eyes as if rereading a script older than words. He whispered softly to himself, the old blessing passed down from scribe to scribe, from temple to teacher, may the words we write outlive us. May they be read not only with the eyes, but with still hearts." Then he stepped away from the window and placed another clay tablet onto the shelf, sliding it gently into the space between others. The tablet in Lillidan had written remained out to dry, its surface smooth and calm. Nabzeri sat down once. Morin took up a blank piece of clay. He didn't write. Not yet. He simply sat and held it, feeling its cool surface against his palm, as if listening for the words it wished to carry. Outside, Babylon slept. The great ziggurat stood in the distance, a shadowed stairway to the stars. The river moved in silence. The gardens folded into themselves for rest, and within the small, quiet home, one man and one boy shared a moment of peace not easily found, a slowness that asked for nothing, a night that wrapped itself around them like a promise. Tomorrow would bring tasks, lessons, and sunlight, but tonight belonged to stillness. Morning arrived with quiet dignity. The city of Babylon woke not with blaring sounds or sudden motion, but with the soft layering of life returning to its rhythm. Roosters crowed distantly, vendors began lifting their awnings in the lower streets, and the canal beyond Nabzeri's home reflected the pale hues of early dawn, lavender melting into a soft gold. Inside, the air was still cool, and the faint glow of the new day crept across the floor. Nabzeri opened his eyes slowly. He had not slept long, but sleep was never deep for him anymore. He had grown used to resting in fragments, enough to feel restored, never so much as to lose the gentle grip he held on the world just beyond the veil. And Lillidan stirred on his mat near the hearth, the woven blanket shifting softly over him. The boy did not wake yet, his breath even and calm, his limbs folded in the loose sprawl of youth. Nabzeri smiled faintly, letting the boy linger in dreams. Outside, the water from the canal lapped rhythmically against the edge of the bank, a sound so constant and familiar it was no longer noticed until it stopped, and it never did. The Euphrates was the vein of the city, a silent, ever-flowing lifeline through palaces and pastures alike, and this morning it carried not urgency, but peace. Nabzeri dressed slowly, tying his sash and washing his hands with cool water from a clay bowl by the door. He moved with the quietness that came only from years of repetition, each motion fluid, deliberate. Soft, he lit a new stick of incense from the temple quarter, cedar resin this time, sharp but smooth, and set it into the small dish. Beside his tablet shelf, as it began to smolder, a sweet, dry scent filled the room, like sun-warmed wood and old prayers. He stepped outside for a moment, bare feet brushing against the smooth stone path. The breeze was gentle this morning, rising off the river and curling through the reeds, across the canal. He could see the tops of the ziggurat just visible through the mist. Even now, in the early light, the steps of the great temple were painted with shadow and gold. A fisherman's boat slid by, its oars dipping silently. The man aboard raised his hand in quiet greeting. Nabzeri returned the gesture, then stepped back inside, and Lillidan was sitting up now, blinking against the amber morning light filtering through the small window. "Did I sleep long?" he asked softly. "Just enough," Nabzeri replied, handing him a small bowl of soaked dates and grains. "Eat slowly. Today we walk." The boy looked up, curious. "Where?" "To the southern garden. There are palms in bloom there, and I want you to hear the wind in them. It's a lesson." And Lillidan nodded, chewing thoughtfully. "A lesson in what?" "In listening." By the time the sun cleared the eastern walls of the city, they were already walking, side by side, carrying a light satchel with clay, stylus, and flat stones. The streets were not yet crowded, just the occasional call of a merchant, the rustle of a linen curtain being drawn open, the low chant of a priest in morning prayer. They passed beneath archways lined with blue-painted bricks, depictions of bulls and lions running in sequence along the walls. The famous processional road, though grander near the center of Babylon, reached even the quieter quarters, where its images remained like memories pressed into the city's very bones. As they walked, and Lillidan pointed to the symbols on the bricks. "Why do the lions always walk forward?" "To remind us that time does not turn back," Nabzeri said. "Even the lion walks toward change." They reached the edge of the southern garden by mid-morning. It was not a garden for food or trade, but a space of shade and air, a place meant for rest. Tamarisks and palms rustled softly above stone benches. A narrow channel ran through the center, carrying clear water that had once passed through the hands of engineers who understood how to speak with the river. They sat beneath a tall date palm. The sun filtered through the long, feathered fronds. In strips of gold and shadow, birds called out from the heights, darting between branches and vines. Nabzeri reached into the satchel and withdrew to fresh tablets, placing them on the ground between them. "We'll write here," he said, "but not now. First, listen." Enlilidin closed his eyes as instructed. Nabzeri did the same. And so they sat, the two of them, not speaking, not moving, simply listening. To the breeze winding through the fronds, to the distant chatter of market-goers, to the trickle of water slipping past stone, to the subtle murmur of insects in the warm underbrush. To the city itself, breathing. Minutes passed, perhaps more. When Nabzeri opened his eyes, he said quietly, "What did you hear?" The boy thought a moment. "The palm leaves talk when they move." "They do," Nabzeri said. "That is the sound of time stretching. That's the voice you must understand before you ever try to speak with the past." They began writing then, each on their own clay, each with their own hand. The boy wrote about the way the fronds curled and clicked, Nabzeri, about the memory of sitting beneath those same trees. As a boy, when his own teacher had first brought him there, the city was a teacher, always. The sky above it a scroll, the river an ancient whisper. Babylon spoke, not in shouts, not in grandeur, but in gentle, everlasting ways, and those who listened became its memory. By midday, the heat began to settle more heavily upon the city, and even the birds quieted, retreating to the cool shadows under leaves and eaves. Nabzeri and Enlilidin remained in the garden, their tablets drying slowly on a sun-warmed flat stone. Neither of them rushed. There was no reason to. The garden's stone path twisted past a shallow reflecting pool, its surface dappled with petals from overhanging vines. Nabzeri led the way along it, his footsteps soundless against the warm stones. As they walked, he paused every so often, not to point or explain, but to listen, to let the space speak first. He believed the world always told you something if you moved slow enough to hear it. Enlilidin followed, growing more attuned to the rhythm of this silent lesson. At first, he would have asked questions, but now, he simply watched and waited, trusting that meaning would come not with explanation, but with experience. At the far end of the garden, beyond a low wall of baked stone, a gate led to a lesser-known corner of the temple district, a quiet place Nabzeri remembered well. He pushed open the wooden gate gently. The hinges creaked a little, and a small burst of warm air escaped like the exhale of a resting room. It was the old scribal courtyard, a place once used by scholars and temple copyists to practice sacred script under open sky. Most no longer came here. The newer schools had moved closer to the temple ziggurat, where polished floors and official scrolls lined the walls. But Nabzeri preferred the quiet corners, the ones not gilded with ceremony. The courtyard was rectangular, lined on all sides by short pillars and framed with papyrus reeds growing from small water channels that crisscrossed beneath the stone flooring. A fig tree stood at the center, its broad leaves casting a gentle circle of shade. Here and there, ancient marks were still carved into the stone benches, reminders of long-past lessons and idle moments. Nabzeri sat, and Enlilidin joined him. Neither spoke. Instead, Nabzeri reached into his satchel again and pulled out a slender, rolled reed, a stylus shaped not for clay, but for ink, and beside it, a thin scroll made from stretched bark, soft and pale. The boy leaned in, curious. "You've used only clay," Nabzeri said, unrolling the scroll slightly. "But bark speaks differently. Clay records, bark listens." Enlilidin tilted his head, trying to grasp the meaning. "Clay holds shape," Nabzeri explained softly. "What you press into it stays, unchanged. Bark absorbs over time. The ink fades a little, the bark weathers, but it also breathes. It changes with you." He dipped the reed into a tiny pot of dark ink and passed it to the boy. "Try writing not what happened, write how it felt." Enlilidin hesitated, then slowly began to write, his strokes delicate, his posture bent with focus. He wrote not of the morning itself, but of the feeling of quiet footsteps on stone, of the shade under the fig tree, of the distant water wheels creaking song beyond the garden wall. He described the way the sun warmed his shoulder as he sat, and the way the shadows moved like slow dancers across the floor. Nabzeri watched in silence, his hands folded in his lap. After a long while, the boy set the reed down. The older scribe took the scroll gently, reading it slowly. He said nothing at first, then finally looked up and gave a slow, approving nod. "You have begun to hear the space between things," he said. "That is where the oldest stories hide." They sat quietly for a time, sharing a small dish of dates and pomegranate seeds. The breeze was cooler now, and the shadows lengthened across the courtyard floor. "You used to come here?" and Lillian asked, gently breaking the silence. "I did," Nabzeri replied. "When I was your age, and later, when I was older, I wrote many things here, lessons, lists, even the story of my family. Most are gone now. The clay broke, the bark wore away, but the memory remains." And Lillian leaned back, gazing up at the sky just beyond the fig leaves. "Will all stories disappear?" "Not if someone remembers," Nabzeri said. "Stories aren't only in tablets. They're in how we walk, how we greet the wind, how we sit beside a tree in silence. Writing is just one way of listening." And Lillian seemed to take that in slowly, watching the last of the light filter across the stone's dot. By late afternoon, the garden's birds had returned, filling the air with soft chirps and fluttering wings. The two scribes gathered their scrolls and tablets and began the slow walk back through the temple corridor, past the still pools and reed-covered walls. The city was beginning to shift again, shops reopening after the midday pause, families preparing for evening, distant drums beginning their low, rhythmic calls from the festival square. But Nabzeri's street was quieter, removed just enough from the center to preserve the hush that wrapped around twilight. As they entered the doorway once more, the scent of evening bread baking in nearby homes greeted them like an old song. Inside, the room was dim now. Nabzeri lit 2 lamps, one for each of them, and laid out clean tablets. "Tonight," he said gently, "you will write the story of the fig tree." And Lillian smiled. "I will," he said, "but I'll start with the sound of the water beneath the floor." Nabzeri nodded slowly, content. The boy was beginning to understand, not just how to scribe, but how to carry stillness, how to cradle the past gently, like water in cupped hands. Outside, Babylon whispered dot, and inside, the next story began. That night, the stars returned in full strength, blanketing the sky with ancient constellations that had guided farmers, travelers, priests, and poets alike for generations. From Nabzeri's home, the sky unfolded wide and unbroken, like a scroll opened by the gods themselves. The 2 lamps flickered gently, their flames small and steady. They filled the room with warmth and the faint scent of oil and clay. And Lillian sat with his new tablet in front of him, stylus poised but unmoving. His thoughts were not yet fully shaped into words, and Nabzeri did not disturb him. The older man sat beside him with a worn tablet in his lap, slowly tracing the engraved lines of a story he had written long ago. A quiet smile played on his lips, not from amusement, but from remembrance. The silence stretched between them, soft and full. It was the kind of silence that felt like a gift rather than a void. The room itself seemed to lean into it, holding its breath as if listening to the stories that had not yet been told. At last, and Lillian began to write. His hand moved slowly, deliberately, each mark carefully pressed into the damp surface of the clay. He wrote of the fig tree, not just its appearance, but the way its leaves had murmured secrets, how the breeze seemed to bend differently near its trunk, how the light there shifted like water. Nabzeri glanced over and nodded with quiet pride. "You are learning not just to record," he said softly, "but to feel." And Lillian didn't answer at first, still focused. But then, after a pause, he asked, "Is this how you learned, watching trees and writing stories about wind?" Nabzeri chuckled gently, the sound low and kind. "In a way, my teacher was sterner than I am. He believed in structure, in discipline. But even he knew that the world teaches in its own language. He would take me to the canal in the early morning, before even the priests had stirred, and tell me to listen to the mud as it moved. Everything speaks, he said, even the quiet things. And Lillidan looked up. And did they speak? To you? They still do, Nabzeri replied. The boy nodded slowly and returned to his work, the stylus moving with more confidence now. Outside, the sounds of the city shifted again. The festival square quieted. The final carts returned to their homes. Dogs barked faintly in the distance, and above all of it, the river continued its slow journey, unseen but always felt. After some time, Nabzeri rose and crossed the room. To a high shelf from it, he took down a scroll bound in soft reed twine. It was older than most of the things in the house, and the edges were worn smooth by many hands. He brought it to the low table and sat across from Lillidan. This, he said, is a gift from my teacher. He wrote it when he was young, a story not about kings or gods, but about a baker who rose before dawn each day to prepare loaves. For the city, it's simple, but true, and that makes it important. And Lillidan reached out, his fingers brushing the surface of the scroll. Can I read it? Nabzeri smiled. You can listen. And so he read, slowly, softly. The way stories were meant to be heard at night. His voice moved gently through the air, like the movement of the river, like the flickering of the lamp flames. The tale was modest. It spoke of a man named Tapti, who kept to his craft with such care that even the local temple offered to purchase his bread for offerings. It told of flour ground by hand, of careful measurements, of ovens warmed with firewood collected under moonlight. There were no battles, no divine visitations, only the quiet beauty of a life shaped by patience. When it ended, Nabzeri said nothing more. He simply rolled the scroll back into its binding and set it aside. The silence afterward was not empty. It was full of meaning. And Lillidan looked down at his own tablet, then back up at his teacher. Why did he write that story? Because he saw the sacred in the simple, Nabzeri said. Not everyone can, but a scribe must. The boy absorbed that slowly, then whispered, I think I understand. They rose not long after to extinguish the lamps and stretch their limbs. The night had deepened, and the edges of sleep had begun to tug at their thoughts. And Lillidan laid his tablet near the others to dry, and Nabzeri did the same. But before they retreated to their mats, Nabzeri led the boy once more to the doorway where the city beyond their walls slept under the stars. They stood there for a long moment, shoulder to shoulder, gazing out over the quiet rooftops, the distant glow of temple fires, the river's soft, endless motion. The city, Nabzeri said, is older than us. It has seen more than we can ever know. But tonight, this moment, it belongs to us, and we belong to it. And Lillidan nodded, his gaze never leaving the horizon. They turned back inside, leaving the door slightly ajar to let the night breathe into the room. And as they laid down to rest, the city held them in its gentle rhythm, a rhythm of quiet breath, of dreams made of clay and ink, of stories that whispered not to be remembered, but simply to be felt. The next morning began with a quiet hush that seemed to have settled gently over the entire city. Even the usual sounds, the bray of donkeys in distant courtyards, the shuffling of sandals over stone, came more slowly, more thoughtfully. The air was cool and carried the scent of dust, river reeds, and something floral, the faint perfume of early blooming acacia carried from the northern fields. Inside the house, Nabzeri was already awake. He sat cross-legged beside a window that opened toward the canal, the first light of morning warming his face in faint gold. He held a cup of barley tea, its steam rising in slow curls, blending with the lingering scent of last night's lamp oil. And Lillidan still slept, his young body curled beneath a light blanket. The stylus he had used the night before lay beside him, forgotten in his dreaming hand. Nabzeri didn't disturb him. He had learned long ago that lessons didn't only come from words and writing. Sometimes they came from rest, from stillness, from knowing when not to speak. Eventually, the boy stirred and sat up, rubbing his eyes and blinking at the light filtering through the latticework. His hair was tousled, and his voice was quiet. When he asked, "Is it late?" "It is morning," Nabzeri replied with a soft smile. "And that is enough." They ate simply, flatbread dipped in date syrup, and fresh slices of fig. Outside, the water carriers passed with balanced jars on their shoulders, and a temple attendant swept the street with broad palm branches. A young girl skipped past with her sandals in hand, laughing at the cool stone beneath her feet. And Lillidan looked out at the waking world and asked, "Are we going to the temple today?" "We are going somewhere better," Nabzeri replied. "To the house of a friend." "A weaver, a weaver," the boy echoed curiously. "Yes," Nabzeri said as he stood. "She tells stories in thread." The walk to the weaver's quarter was long, winding past spice stalls and pottery workshops, past sun-drenched courtyards with hanging gardens, where vines grew in lazy spirals from hanging pots. The streets were alive, but not loud. Babylon moved like a creature at peace with its breath. They arrived at a low, wide home framed with plastered walls and a roof overgrown with creeping vines. The doorway was open, and a curtain of hanging reeds whispered softly in the breeze. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dyed wool, herbs, and something faintly metallic. The tang of bronze tools used for threading and trimming. Kalatu, the weaver, stood near a large wooden loom. Her hair was streaked with silver and wrapped in a saffron scarf. She looked up as they entered, her eyes sharp but kind. "Nabzeri," she said warmly. "You've brought the boy." "I have," he replied. "He's learning how to hear stories before he writes them." Kalatu nodded, her fingers never pausing as she wove. "Then he has come to the right place," and Lillidan watched in fascination. Colored threads stretched across the loom in careful tension, and her hands moved between them with quiet precision. Each motion was fluid, practiced, not rushed, but deeply assured. What are you weaving?" the boy asked. "A story about rain," she said. "About the last flood that fed the fields before summer came." And Lillidan's brow furrowed. "How do you tell a story with threads?" Kalatu smiled without turning. "The colors carry memory. The pattern carries time. The spaces between the threads, that is where the spirit lives." He watched her hands closely. Some threads were pale like dawn, others deep blue like the river at dusk. She wove in red, gold, and a smoky brown that reminded him of the earth after a storm. No words, no ink, but meaning, somehow, was there. Nabzeri stepped beside him. "Listen with your eyes," he whispered. And so when Lillidan did, he listened to the hush of the loom, the creak of its frame, the quiet chant Kalatu sang under her breath as she worked. The room itself seemed to lean in around them, as if the walls, too, had once been threads. Kalatu eventually stopped, tied off her line, and gestured to a folded cloth nearby. "Take it," she said to the boy. He picked it up. It was a small panel, soft in his hands, its pattern a spiral of stars woven in midnight blue. A single thread of silver ran through the center, catching the light as he turned it. "What does it mean?" he asked. She looked at him thoughtfully. "It means whatever you remember it to mean." They left the weaver's home not long after, stepping back into the golden sun. And Lillidan carried the cloth carefully, holding it close, as if it might whisper to him. "Will we write about her?" he asked. "You will," Nabzeri said, "but not today. Let her story sit with you a while." Back home, the light was beginning to slant toward afternoon. Nabzeri set out tablets and a small bowl of ink, but he did not speak. He simply sat and began to write, not words from his head, but from his hands, slow and without effort. The boy did the same. Their room filled once more with the soft sound of stylus on clay, the creak of reed pens, the sighing hush of thought turning into symbol dot in the distance. Bells began to ring from the eastern tower, signaling the coming of evening. But inside the home of Nabzeri, time moved only as fast as the story required. Evening returned with the same grace it always carried in Babylon, soft and slow, like a cloak being gently drawn across the shoulders of the world. Shadows lengthened along the courtyard walls, and the color of the sky ripened from dusty gold to plum, then indigo. The air, once warm, now cooled enough to carry the scent of baked earth and jasmine from nearby terraces. Inside Nabzeri's home, the oil lamps had not yet been lit. They sat in that quiet window of time when the day was not quite over, but the night had not fully arrived. It was a moment meant for reflection, a sacred space between movement and rest. And Lillidan was still at his tablet, though his stylus now moved in slower strokes. He wasn't tired, just thoughtful. He kept glancing at the woven cloth from Calita that now rested beside him. Every now and then, his fingers would brush over the silver thread that ran through its center. There was something in it that reminded him of the river, not its shape or its sound, but its feeling, its presence. Nabzeri, seated across from him, looked up from his own work. "What do you see when you touch that cloth?" he asked gently. Dottie and Lillidan didn't answer immediately. He studied the thread again and said, "I see the sound of water. I feel the quiet in her weaving. It's like a story that doesn't need to be explained." The old scribe nodded with calm approval. "Then you understand." And Lillidan looked up. "Understand what?" "That some stories are written without words. They live in the way something feels in your hand, or the way a place smells at dusk, or the sound a clay jar makes when set down on a stone floor. We are not just scribes of tablets. In Lillidan, we are scribes of silence." A hush passed between them, gentle and full. The boy looked down at the scroll he'd begun earlier and, with more care this time, began to write again. Not just what had happened that day, but how it had made him feel. He didn't write about the loom or the cloth exactly, but about a song sung without voice, about silver rivers that moved without banks, about wisdom woven into air. When he was done, he looked up at Nabzeri, who had been quietly watching the darkening sky. "Can I ask you something?" Lillidan said. "Of course. Why did you choose to live here, away from the temple schools, away from the scribal courts?" Nabzeri leaned back slightly, resting his hands in his lap. "I didn't leave the city," he said. "I found the part of it that listened. Among scrolls and scribes, there's often too much speaking, too much proving. Here, the words are allowed to rest. And so am I." The boy thought about that. "Do you miss the temple sometimes?" Nabzeri smiled faintly. "I miss the sound of its bells, but not the sound of its pride." And Lillidan looked at his own tablet again, tracing the edge of it with his thumb. "Do you think I'll ever be a scribe like you?" "No," the older man said with a quiet certainty. "You'll be a scribe like you." They both smiled. Later, as the stars emerged one by one in the sky above, Nabzeri stood and crossed the room to light the lamps. He moved slowly, reverently. Each flame was a small ritual, each spark a prayer of warmth and attention. The soft glow filled the room once more, dancing off the clay walls and giving shape to the stories resting on every surface. They ate a simple evening meal, lentil stew, cooled bread, and sliced quince. The kind of food that required no conversation, only appreciation. The boy chewed thoughtfully, watching the shadows flicker across the floor. He had begun to notice small things more clearly now. The way light shifted, the rhythm of his teacher's footsteps, the scent of old papyrus mingled with the oil in the lamps. When they finished, Nabzeri set down his bowl and turned toward the small alcove near the back of the room, a space reserved for memory. There, resting on a ledge, were several old tablets, worn and cracked, and a single reed flute. He picked it up gently. "I used to play this at night," he said. "Not for music, just to hear the air." He brought it to his lips and blew softly. The sound that emerged was low and breathy, more whisper than tone. It echoed faintly in the quiet room, rising and falling like a thought remembered just in time. It wasn't a melody, it was presence, and Lillidan closed his eyes as the sound filled the space. He let it settle into him, into the spaces between his ribs, into the slow rhythm of his heart. It was a sound that asked nothing, promised nothing. It simply existed. When the song ended, Nabzeri returned the flute to its place and sat back down. "That," he said softly, "is the space from which stories come." They said little else that night, and Lillidan returned to his mat, the woven cloth still in his hands. He laid it beside him, close enough to feel. Nabzeri extinguished the lamps one by one, until only starlight remained. And as the hush of the Babylonian night wrapped around them once more, a peaceful silence filled the room. It was the kind of silence that carried stories, that listened more than it spoke. A silence older than words, deeper than ink, a silence worth remembering. Morning returned with the hush of dawn, soft and unhurried. The sky above Babylon was streaked with pale rose and the faintest hints of gold, as if the sun had gently painted its rival upon the clouds. Enlilidon stirred from sleep with the ease of someone who had rested well, the kind of rest that comes only when a soul feels safe, seen, and held by the rhythm of quiet days. Nabzeri was already awake, though not at his desk. Instead, he stood barefoot in the courtyard, gently sweeping the dusty stone floor with a brush made of bundled reeds. He didn't look up as Enlilidon appeared in the doorway, but the smile in his voice welcomed him. "Good morning," he said, his sweeping slow and steady. "Did you dream?" Enlilidon nodded, rubbing his eyes. "Yes, but I don't remember." "What about?" "Then it was probably a good dream," Nabzeri replied softly. "Not all dreams are meant to stay. Some are like birds. They visit, they sing, then they leave." The boy stepped out into the sunlight, its warmth wrapping around him like a well-worn cloak. He helped his teacher gather the fallen leaves from the fig tree in the corner, placing them into a clay basin that smelled faintly of rainwater and thyme. Today felt different, not rushed, but purposeful. There was a clarity in the air, as if something unspoken was waiting to unfold. As they returned inside, Nabzeri unrolled a fresh sheet of parchment and laid it flat upon the writing surface. Instead of tablets, they would use ink today, a slower, more deliberate form of writing, one that invited reflection. "We're going to write a letter," Nabzeri said. "To who?" Enlilidon asked. "To someone you'll never meet," his teacher answered. "To someone who may find this letter long after we are both gone. A scribe writes not only for the living, but also for the ones yet to come." Enlilidon sat down slowly, adjusting his posture as Nabzeri handed him a thin brush and the small pot of dark ink. The scent of it rose lightly into the room, sharp, earthy, ancient. "What should I say?" the boy asked. Nabzeri smiled gently. "Say what you would want someone to know if they lived 1,000 years from now. Tell them what matters to you, what feels real." Enlilidon looked down at the parchment. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, with a breath as soft as the wind, he began to write. He wrote of the fig tree in the courtyard and how its branches made patterns against the morning sky. He described the woven cloth from Kalatu and the silver thread that ran through it like a river. He wrote about the sound of the reed flute echoing through the house and the silence that came afterward, a silence filled with stories. He wrote about Nabzeri and his calm voice and the way he taught by listening, not just speaking. He wrote about the way Babylon looked at night, with stars reflected in shallow water, and how the city sometimes felt like it was holding its breath between heartbeats. He didn't write to impress. He wrote to remember. And Nabzeri, seated nearby, didn't speak. He simply watched, not the brush, not the ink, but the boy himself, as he quietly stepped into the space that all scribes eventually reach, the space where their thoughts begin to shape the world, not just describe it. When the letter was finished, they left it to dry. Enlilidon placed a small stone on the corner of the parchment to keep it from curling. He touched the edge of the page with reverence, as though sealing something sacred within it. Nabzeri finally spoke again. "That was your first letter. To time, the first of many." Enlilidon looked at him, eyes wide. "Do you think someone will really read it? One day?" "Maybe," Nabzeri said with a slow nod. "But that isn't the point. The point is that you gave something to the world, not to be praised, but to be remembered." The day moved on with its quiet rhythm. The sun climbed slowly, warming the whitewashed walls, and a soft wind carried in the scent of dates and distant incense from temple courtyards. Children played somewhere beyond the walls, their laughter like wind chimes. Fleeting and sweet. In the afternoon, a visitor arrived. Her name was Ninkala, an old friend of Nabzeri's. She was a potter, her hands permanently dusted with the memory of clay. She brought with her 2 small drinking cups, newly fired and painted with gentle spirals. "For your tea," she said with a smile, placing one in Nabzeri's hands and the other in Enlilidon's. The cups were simple, beautiful, functional, but made with care, like everything in this small, thoughtful home. Ninkala stayed for tea and told a quiet story about her workshop, where swallows had nested in the rafters. She described how one morning she had paused her wheel just to listen to them, how their chirping had sounded like laughter, how their wings moved like soft brushes against the wind. They reminded me, she said, that not all creation needs to be guided. Sometimes it just happens, beautifully, and Lillidan listened intently. He was beginning to understand something, that stories weren't always found in grand halls or ancient scrolls. They lived in pottery and thread, in quiet tea shared with friends, in the rhythm of daily things that most eyes overlooked. When Ninkala left, Nabzeri returned to his desk and retrieved one of his older scrolls. He didn't open it. He simply held it in his lap, tracing the string that bound it. "There's something sacred," he said quietly, about knowing when to speak and when to be still. That evening, they ate together on the floor again. A small oil lamp burned between them, casting slow-moving shadows on the wall, and Lillidan felt no need to speak. And Nabzeri, sensing this, simply smiled. Later, they stepped outside into the courtyard where the stars had begun to appear, scattered like thoughts across the canvas of night. The fig tree's leaves rustled gently above them. "You've grown in silence," Nabzeri said softly, and Lillidan looked up at him. "Is that good?" The old scribe nodded. "It's where real stories begin." And once again, the hush of night folded around them, steady, warm, and full of quiet meaning. The next morning began with a rare fog, a veil of white that softened the lines of the city and turned even the sharpest edges into quiet suggestion. The tops of ziggurats and towers vanished into the mist, and even the sun's light felt like it passed through water. Before touching the earth, Nabzeri welcomed the fog. He stood at the entrance to his home, wrapped in a long wool shawl, and watched as the city slowed. Market stalls opened later. Vendors spoke more gently. The footsteps of passers-by were muffled, transformed into soft echoes on the wet stones. It was a morning for listening inward, and Lillidan joined him silently, rubbing sleep from his eyes. His voice was still tinged with dream when he asked, "Why is it so quiet?" "The sky is closer to the earth today," Nabzeri said, "and when that happens, we speak with softer voices so we don't disturb the meeting." The boy accepted that explanation without question. In Nabzeri's world, such things made perfect sense. They stepped back inside, where the warmth of the clay walls held the night's heat. Nabzeri unrolled a scroll from a narrow shelf, older than most, with brittle edges and ink faded to soft gray. He laid it between them on the table with great care. "This was written by my teacher," he said, his fingertips resting just above the ancient script, "when I was your age." And Lillidan leaned closer. The handwriting was careful, each character shaped with devotion, though age had softened their edges. "Can I read it?" he asked. "You may try," Nabzeri said, "but don't rush. These words are not meant to be consumed. They are meant to be tasted." And so the boy began, slowly, hesitantly, sounding out the syllables one by one. The language was older, more formal, but still familiar. It was a reflection of what they studied, yet infused with something deeper, the weight of time. The passage was a meditation on stillness, how silence could be a teacher, how water could be a scribe, how the wind wrote stories against the skin. It spoke of rivers that forgot their banks and dreams that led to waking. When Lillidan finished, he sat in quiet awe. "He was only my age," Nabzeri nodded, "but he had already learned how to listen to things that did not speak." The fog lingered through midday, and they decided not to go out. Instead, Nabzeri retrieved his collection of stone seals, tiny objects carved with precision, each bearing a unique image that once marked tablets and clay with the identities of kings, merchants, and poets. "Seals are not just names," he said as he laid them out. "They are the dreams people want remembered." One bore a lion chasing a gazelle, another a crescent moon cradled in a palm. There was one with a small house under a star, and another with reeds growing by a river's edge. Each seal was different. Each, Nabzeri explained, told a different kind of truth. He handed in Lillidan a small lump of clay and one of the simpler seals, a sun above to hills. "Press it slowly," he instructed. "Let the clay accept it. Don't force the shape." The boy did as told, and when he lifted the seal, he smiled. The imprint was perfect. "This is what it means to leave a mark," Nabzeri said quietly. "Not by shouting, by pressing gently." Later, when the mist began to lift and the outlines of the city returned, Enlilidin sat on the floor with a fresh tablet, without instruction. He began to write, not from a prompt, not from memory, but from feeling. He wrote of fog that taught, stillness, of seals that whispered identity, of words written by boys who had long since become dust and yet still spoke. The characters he formed were cleaner now, more confident. But even more than that, they carried something deeper, intention. Nabzeri watched him work. He said nothing, but his face softened with quiet pride. The afternoon passed in slow turns of time. Outside, the street filled again with soft activity, not hurried, but gentle. The kind of movement that came after reflection. A neighbor stopped by to leave a small basket of pomegranates, deep red and sweet. Enlilidin peeled one open slowly, marveling at the glistening seeds within. "They look like tiny hearts," he said, "because they carry life inside them," Nabzeri replied. They shared the fruit without ceremony, juice staining their fingers. The act of eating felt sacred in its own way, not because of ritual, but because of attention. The pomegranate, like everything else in their world, had become part of the story. That evening, they returned to the rooftop. The stars were especially bright now that the fog had passed. Nabzeri pointed out the constellations, naming them, not just by their shapes, but by the stories they carried. "That one is the fisherman," he said, indicating a loose curve of stars. He cast his net across the heavens and caught only silence. But even silence, he learned, could be nourishing. Enlilidin looked upward, the cool air brushing his face. "What do you think the stars write about?" he asked. Nabzeri chuckled. "They write about us, about our questions, our stillness, our hope." They stayed there long into the night, watching the slow spin of the sky. Neither spoke much. There was nothing that needed to be said. The world, in that moment, was full, and when they finally descended the stairs back into the house, Enlilidin paused at the threshold and looked back at the stars one more time. He didn't say goodbye. He simply blinked once, slowly, and carried their stories with him into the darkness. The days in Babylon moved like quiet water, flowing, never rushing. Morning gave way to afternoon, and afternoon to twilight, in a rhythm that felt less like time and more like breathing. It was within this rhythm that Enlilidin now lived, not as a guest, but as part of the house itself, like the papyrus scrolls on the shelves, the worn sandals at the door, the soft reed mats that remembered every footstep. One late morning, after a breakfast of dates and barley cakes, Nabzeri unwrapped a bundle of old tablets, each one etched with knowledge from decades past. He placed them carefully before Enlilidin, like a priest laying offerings at an altar. "These," he said, "are records of our ancestors, not kings or warriors, ordinary people, craftsmen, midwives, traders. You will read them slowly, and not for information, for understanding." Enlilidin nodded and picked up the first tablet. Its clay was smooth, the characters neat, shaped with loving patience. The words told of a potter who had once lived near the city's southern wall, a man who recorded the temperature of his kiln, the moisture of his clay, and how the sky looked each morning before he began his work. There was nothing dramatic in the tale, no battles, no royal commands, just the daily ritual of shaping earth with hands, and through that, shaping a life. As the boy read, he felt a closeness to the potter. He could almost see the man hunched over his wheel, dust on his elbows, his lips moving silently as he worked. It was a life of focus, of devotion to repetition, and somehow, it resonated more deeply than the epic tales he had studied before. Nabzeri watched the boy quietly, reading his reactions more than the tablet itself. "That potter," he said, gently, "left no monuments, no statues, but in these words, he remains. We remember him not because he sought attention, but because he paid attention." Enlilidin carefully returned the tablet to its cloth wrapping. "It's strange," he said softly. "He lived so long ago, and yet, I feel like I know him." "That is the gift of stories," Nabzeri replied. "They let us sit beside people we have never met and walk paths we've never seen. In them, we find not just others, but ourselves." The next tablet was from a healer, a woman who had cataloged the properties of herbs she gathered from the banks of the Euphrates. Her handwriting was precise, her tone calm and steady. and Lillian was drawn to her clarity, how she described the way chamomile soothed fever or how crushed figs eased aching joints. But what moved him most were the margins of the tablet, where small notations had been made. Personal reflections, gratitude, hopes. She wrote this for herself. He whispered, not for anyone else. Yes, Nabzeri said, and that is why it endures, outside. The wind stirred the leaves of the fig tree. A shadow passed over the courtyard wall. A bird overhead, moving silently against the wide blue sky. They spent the remainder of the day reading more tablets, pausing between each to discuss not the facts, but the feelings behind them. A shepherd's journal, a merchant's list of goods sold and customers visited, a father's record of his daughter's first steps. None of it was grand, and all of it was sacred. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the city, casting long golden light across the courtyard, Nabzeri brought out two bowls and filled them with warm lentils and soft bread soaked in olive oil. They ate slowly, savoring each bite. I think I understand now, and Lillian said after a time. Why you left the temple? Why you live this way? Nabzeri looked up with curiosity. It's not just the silence, the boy continued. It's what the silence lets you hear. The older man smiled. You're becoming a scribe of the real world, he said, not just of tablets, but of breaths, of pauses, of all the things that happen in between the noise. When the meal was finished, they lit the lamps as they always did, one by one, in gentle reverence. The flames flickered softly on the walls, their glow mingling with the deepening dark. Then Nabzeri did something unexpected. He walked to a corner of the room and retrieved a small, lacquered box. From it, he removed a bundle wrapped in soft linen. He handed it to Lillian with care. This, he said, was given to me by my own teacher when he knew my journey had begun. Now I give it to you. The boy unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a stylus, carved from cedar, its tip smooth and darkened by years of use. Though simple in appearance, it felt heavy in his hands, not from weight, but from meaning. Use it, Nabzeri said softly, only when the words truly matter. Let it remind you that not everything must be written, but when it is, write with care. And Lillian nodded, overcome with quiet emotion. That night, before sleep, he sat beside the empty tablet on his mat and simply held the stylus. He didn't write. He didn't need to. Not yet. Instead, he listened to the wind brushing the walls, to the distant hum of the city settling into sleep, to the deep, still breath of the house itself. He let it all enter him like water soaking into dry earth. And when he finally lay down, the stylus still beside him, he knew that he would one day write a story worth leaving behind. But for now, the listening was enough. The air the next morning carried the coolness of early fall. Though the sun still rose in its usual grandeur, it did so with a gentler heat, casting long shadows across the streets of Babylon. In the distance, a thin plume of smoke rose from a baker's oven, and the scent of warm barley bread drifted across rooftops and into courtyards, soft and inviting. Inside Nabzeri's home, the day began in stillness, and Lillian had woken earlier than usual, stirred not by noise, but by a dream he could not quite remember. It had left behind only a feeling of someone whispering from far away, like a voice on the wind just before dawn. He didn't tell Nabzeri about it right away. Instead, he stepped quietly into the courtyard where a pot of tea steamed gently beside the coals, waiting. He poured 2 cups and waited for his teacher to join him. You're awake early, Nabzeri said as he emerged, shawl draped loosely over his shoulder, the lines of sleep still soft on his face. I had a dream, the boy said, but I don't know what it meant, or even what happened. It just felt important. Nabzeri sat beside him, accepting the tea with both hands. Some dreams are not meant to be understood, only held, like a cup of water on a hot day. It refreshes you, even if you forget the taste. They drank in silence for a while, the only sound being the gentle tapping of a reed against the stone wall in the breeze. Eventually, Nabzeri rose and walked to the low shelf in the corner of the room. He returned with a folded piece of cloth wrapped around something rectangular and heavy. He unwrapped it carefully to reveal an old wax tablet, worn and cracked at the corners. its surface marked with faded indentations, writing long erased, overwritten and erased again. "This belonged to my teacher's teacher," he said. "Before we used clay and ink, we practiced here, where words could be formed and forgotten." Enlilidin took the tablet in his hands. It felt alive, somehow, not because of what was on it, but because of what had once been. "What should I write?" he asked. "Nothing," Nabzeri replied. "Today, you'll erase." The boy looked confused. "Erase what?" "Everything. The lines, the marks, the old shapes. Smooth the surface, slowly, thoughtfully. Make space again." Enlilidin understood. He took the smooth-edged stylus and began to move it across the wax, not to carve, but to clear. With each motion, the lines disappeared, not violently, but like breath fog fading from glass. It took longer than he expected, and as he worked, he began to notice how his thoughts quieted with each stroke. By the time the surface was clean, his mind was still. "This," Nabzeri said, "is what we must do with ourselves sometimes. Erase. Make space. We carry too many words that are not our own." Later that afternoon, they walked together to the banks of the Euphrates. The river was wide and calm, moving at the pace of thought. Merchants ferried goods across on reed rafts, and children played at the edges, letting the muddy water wrap around their ankles. Nabzeri carried a small scroll in his satchel, not for reading, but for gifting. Along the river, near a grove of date palms, lived an old woman named Samu, a weaver, nearly blind, but with fingers that still knew every knot and thread as though guided by memory itself. They found her seated on a low stool, the loom in front of her swaying slightly in the breeze. Her hands moved with slow precision, weaving patterns not from sight, but from the rhythm in her bones. Nabzeri greeted her gently, and she tilted her head in their direction. "You brought the boy," she said. Her voice was dry but kind, like sun-warmed clay. "I did," Nabzeri replied. "And the story?" He handed her the scroll, and she ran her fingers lightly along the edges, then tucked it beneath a folded blanket beside her. She would have someone read it to her later, but even without seeing, she knew it was made with care. "What do you weave?" Enlilidin asked, stepping closer. "Memories," she said. "Not mine, others. They bring me threads from loved ones gone, or from places they've left behind. A shawl from a sister's robe, a thread from a father's sash. I take them and make something new." The boy watched her hands move, over and under, around and through. The strands disappeared into the hole. "It's like writing," he said. Softly, "It is writing," she replied. "Only the loom is my tablet." They stayed for a while, the three of them sitting beneath the swaying palms as the sound of the river filled the air. The sun fell slowly behind the trees, sending ripples of gold across the water's surface. Before they left, Samu handed Enlilidin a small piece of woven cloth. It was no larger than his palm, patterned with two simple bands, one red, one blue. "Remember," she said, "not all stories are told in words." They walked home in silence. That evening, by the light of a single oil lamp, Enlilidin placed the cloth on the shelf beside his writing tools. Then he took out a fresh tablet, dipped his stylus in ink, and began to write. He didn't rush. He let each word arrive like a guest, welcomed and settled before the next one appeared. He wrote about Samu, about the river, about the wax tablet, and the act of erasing. He wrote about dreams that didn't need to be understood and weavers who remembered through touch. And when he reached the end of the page, he didn't sign his name. He simply placed a single dot in the bottom corner, a quiet mark, a presence, not a declaration. Then he blew gently on the ink and let it dry. The night settled gently over Babylon, the kind of night that seemed to hush even the stones. Stars began to prick the sky like tiny lamps lit one by invisible hands, and a cool breeze wandered through the narrow streets, stirring reed blinds and whispering against the mud brick walls. Inside Nabzeri's house, the oil lamp burned low, casting a soft amber glow that clung to the curves of jars and shelves like memories. Enlilidin sat cross-legged near the window, his new tablet resting on his knees. He wasn't writing just yet. He was listening. It had become part of his rhythm now, this quiet sitting at night, Sometimes it seemed that stories floated in the dark air, waiting to be caught like feathers drifting down. He waited for one to settle. Nabzeri emerged from the other room, carrying a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. He sat beside Enlilidin and began to unwrap it, revealing something long, narrow, and dark, a flute carved from polished bone. "I haven't played this in many years," he said with a faint smile, "but some stories are told better in sound than in words." He lifted the flute to his lips and blew softly. The first note was hesitant, like a memory testing its shape. Then another followed, longer, deeper, and slowly, a melody began to form. It wasn't a song in the usual sense. It had no fixed rhythm or pattern. It moved like the wind, rising and falling, pausing when it wished, changing direction like a thought mid-sentence. Enlilidin closed his eyes and listened. The music felt like walking at night beside a river. It felt like the scent of cedarwood smoke. It felt like the silence just after someone you love finishes speaking. It didn't need explanation. It was its own meaning. When Nabzeri stopped, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of what had been played and what had been felt. "My teacher taught me that music is the shape of breath," he said quietly. "And every breath is a story." Enlilidin nodded, still holding the echo of the notes inside him. "Can I learn?" "You already have," Nabzeri said, placing the flute in his lap. "You just don't know it yet." The following morning brought the scent of rain, though the sky had not yet opened. The wind carried the smell of wet earth and gathering clouds. It was a sacred smell, the kind that turned every task into a ritual. They decided not to go out that day. Instead, Nabzeri took out a large scroll, one of the few he kept sealed in a clay tube, and unrolled it carefully on the low table. The edges curled as they flattened, revealing lines upon lines of ancient script. "This is the chronicle of the orchard," he explained. "It's not about battles or kings. It's about one man, a farmer, who recorded every season of his orchard for 30 years. Every bloom, every harvest, every failure, every change in the wind." Enlilidin leaned closer, intrigued. "He never intended it for history," Nabzeri continued. "He just wanted to remember, to understand his trees. But in doing so, he captured something most people miss, the quiet shape of time." They spent hours reading, not all at once, line by line, slowly, between readings. They paused to reflect, to eat slices of fig and warm bread, to listen to the rain that eventually began to fall, tapping gently on the roof like fingers drumming a lullaby. The chronicle spoke of almond blossoms opening to days earlier one spring than the year before, of how the bees came late one season and the fruit suffered, of how one year a bird nested in the tallest fig tree, and how its presence seemed to bless the harvest. It wasn't written poetically, but its honesty had its own beauty. "It's not dramatic," Enlilidin said. "No," Nabzeri agreed. "It's deeper than drama. It's rooted." By midday, the rain had stopped, and the sky returned to its soft blue calm. They rolled up the scroll and returned it to its tube, sealing it again with fresh clay. Nabzeri carved a small mark on the seal, a new symbol, shared between them alone. "It's yours now too," he said. That afternoon, Enlilidin took the flute. He didn't try to play it. Not yet. He simply held it, learning its weight, the smoothness of the bone, the subtle curve of its finger holes. It felt like holding something alive. He carried it to the rooftop and sat in the fading sun. Around him, the city stirred with its familiar low murmur, distant voices, the bleating of goats, the rustle of date palms. The world was awake, but not loud. He liked that dot from his perch. He could see the rooftops of nearby homes, many empty, some with families gathered in quiet conversation, others with figures lost in their own routines. It comforted him, the sameness of life below, the quiet threads that connected them all. He finally lifted the flute to his lips and blew. A single note. It wasn't perfect. It wavered slightly, catching the wind. But it was enough. He played another, then another, letting the notes drift outward into the dusk. Below, someone paused and looked up. A child, maybe, or a mother resting from the day's work. The notes reached them, and though Enlilidin would never know their names, a thread passed between them. invisible and lasting. When he descended the stairs, Nabzeri was waiting. "You played well," he said. "I only played a little. That's often the best kind." That night, before sleep, Enlilidin unrolled a fresh sheet of papyrus and began a new story. Not of kings or wars, not even of tablets or teachers. It began with a tree and a bird and a boy who learned to listen. The days began to pass not as separate events, but as part of a single, flowing stream. Enlilidin no longer counted them. He marked them instead by moments. The first cup of tea in the morning, the rustle of palm fronds at midday, the quiet conversations after sunset. Time in Nabzeri's home wasn't measured, it was experienced. That morning, the wind carried the smell of clay, rich, sun-warmed, and damp from recent rain. It clung to the edges of the courtyard and drifted through the open archways of the house, reminding them both that the potters by the eastern wall of the city would be shaping their new season's wares. Nabzeri turned to the boy after their simple breakfast of cucumbers and cheese. "Today," he said, "we visit the potters." Enlilidin's eyes lit with curiosity. Though he had heard the rhythmic spinning of the potter's wheels from afar, he had never walked among the kilns or seen the hands that shaped the cities. Vessels they left on foot, carrying only a water flask and a folded cloth for any items they might be offered. The streets of Babylon welcomed them with warmth, not loud or bustling, but steady, purposeful. Merchants called softly from shaded stalls, offering cooled wine and dried apricots. A boy swept the steps of a small shrine, pausing to smile. As they passed, near the city's eastern boundary, the walls bore a pale glaze of clay dust. The scent grew stronger, and the occasional echo of stone scraping against wheel filled the air like a heartbeat. They rounded a corner and stepped into the courtyard of the pottery quarter. It was alive, not loud, but full of energy. Rows of wheels spun slowly beneath practiced hands. Clay vessels in all stages of life surrounded them, from lumps of wet earth to gleaming, fire-hardened urns resting on raised platforms. One of the potters, a man with arms streaked in dried mud, looked up from his work and offered a slow nod. "Nabzeri," he said in greeting. "Peace to your hands, Salamu," Nabzeri replied. "And to your wheel." The man gestured for them to come closer, brushing off a low stool. "Sit," he said to Enlilidin. "You have the eyes of a watcher. Let them learn." The boy sat, mesmerized by the wheel's motion. Salamu pressed his fingers into the clay, gently, almost reverently, shaping a narrow vase from a lump no larger than a fist. His hands didn't force the clay, they guided it. "This clay," Salamu said without looking up, "was riverbed silt 3 weeks ago. Now it becomes a vessel. But only if I listen." Enlilidin asked softly. "To its nature," Salamu replied. "To its moisture, its warmth, its breath." He leaned in closer, shaping the neck of the vase with delicate pressure. "If I rush, it collapses. If I hesitate, it hardens before the shape is true. You must meet it where it is." The boy thought of the wax tablet, of the flute, of Samu's weaving. It was all the same, not controlling, but responding, not mastering, but joining. When Salamu finished, he lifted the vase gently and placed it on a tray beside others. Then he offered Enlilidin a small lump of clay. "Try," he said, "not to shape, just to feel." The clay was cool in the boy's hands. He turned it slowly, pressing it with careful fingers. It resisted, then gave, then pushed back again. It was not silent, it had its own quiet language, spoken in firmness and yield. He didn't make anything. He didn't need to. The lesson was in the touch. When they left, Salamu handed him a tiny bowl, smooth, unglazed, but perfect in form, for remembering. He said simply. They returned home in the golden light of late afternoon, and Enlilidin placed the bowl on his shelf beside the woven cloth and wax tablet. Each object held no power on its own, but together they formed a constellation of meaning, a quiet map of his learning. That evening, as the stars returned and the air cooled, Enlilidin wrote. He described the shape of the potter's hands, the sound of the wheel, the soft resistance of clay. He wrote not as a scribe of facts, but as one who had listened, who had touched. Nabzeri read over his shoulder, saying nothing for a long while. Then finally, He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Do you feel it?" he asked Dottie, and Lilith looked up. "Feel what?" "The story. That is becoming you." He paused, letting the words settle. "Every person you meet, every sound you notice, every object you hold, it shapes the vessel of who you are. You are not writing stories. You are being written later, before sleep." And Lilith sat again. With the flute, he played just a few notes, slow, spaced, like footsteps in sand. The sound rose into the night, joining the breath of the city, and somewhere far beyond, perhaps in the hills beyond the river or the edge of the desert, someone else may have heard it and felt the thread pass gently through them too. The next morning arrived quietly, with sunlight slipping through the woven reeds above the doorway in pale, golden strands. And Lilith stirred from sleep slowly, feeling the cool stone beneath his mat and the soft rustle of the morning breeze outside. He had slept deeply, dreamlessly, as though the night itself had cradled him in its arms. Nabzeri was already awake. The scent of simmering barley and herbs wafted in from the kitchen alcove, and the low, careful sound of pottery being moved filled the stillness like a rhythm of its own. And Lilith rose and joined him, saying nothing, only smiling in greeting. As he accepted a warm bowl from his teacher's hands, they ate side by side beneath the archway overlooking the street. It was a quiet day, the kind of day when Babylon did not announce itself, but simply breathed, the kind of day that invited observation rather than action. After breakfast, Nabzeri retrieved a folded piece of cloth from a shelf. Inside, wrapped carefully in linen and tucked between two layers of palm leaf, was an object Lilith had never seen before. A fragment of ancient painted tile. It was curved slightly, perhaps part of a bowl or decorative panel. Deep blue glaze still clung to parts of its surface, though faded, and etched in its center was the outline of a lion's paw, barely visible but unmistakably deliberate. "This," Nabzeri said, turning the tile slowly in his hands, "was once part of a fountain in the palace of Hammurabi." And Lilith leaned in closer, his eyes widening. "How did you get it?" "My teacher gave it to me long ago." And his teacher gave it to him. "It has passed through hands like a quiet word whispered through generations, not for power, not for wealth, only remembrance." He handed it to Lilith. The boy cradled it gently, surprised at its weight. It felt cool and solid, yet also deeply alive, like it had been listening. "For a very long time, there are stories," Nabzeri continued, "that cannot be written down. They live in things, in fragments like this, in wood, in stone, in silence. If you learn to listen, they will speak to you." They wrapped the tile once more and placed it back in its resting cloth. Then, as the morning wore on, they prepared for a walk through the city, not for an errand or a visit, but simply to observe. Babylon stretched before them like a living memory, a city that remembered every footfall, every voice, every thread of incense that had ever risen toward the sky. They passed temple courtyards where priests swept in wide, slow arcs. They passed scribes bent over scrolls, lips moving silently in rhythm with the marks they made. They passed a group of children, watching a bird build its nest in the rafters of a roof. "Do you see?" Nabzeri asked gently. Dottie and Liddin nodded. He did. Not just buildings or people, but relationships, harmony, the invisible threads that connected everything. They came upon a quiet square where an old man was drawing circles in the dust with a stick. At first glance, it seemed meaningless, a child's game, perhaps, but the longer they watched, the more Lilith noticed that each circle connected to the next at precise points, forming patterns that resembled the movement of stars. "He is a sky reader," Nabzeri whispered. "Not a priest, not a mathematician, just a man who watches and remembers." The man looked up, eyes clear and bright despite his years. He didn't speak, only nodded, as if acknowledging that he had been seen, truly seen, and then returned to his quiet task. By the time the sun reached its height, they had returned home. The house was warm and still, the kind of warmth that invited contemplation. Lilith sat with his writing tools but didn't write yet. He was thinking about the tile, about the man drawing stars in the dust, about how much of the world whispered, rather than shouted. That evening, he wrote something different. Not a story, not a lesson, Just a description of a square tile fragment, its curves, its colors, its broken edges. He described how it made him feel, how it reminded him of voices. Carried in stone, he wrote slowly, letting the ink settle after each thought, like footsteps on soft soil. When he finished, he folded the parchment and placed it beneath the tile on the shelf, not to hide it, but to protect it, like a secret between old friends. Before bed, Nabzeri handed him the flute once again. "You do not need to play," he said. "Only hold it." Enlilidin nodded and sat beneath the open archway with the instrument in his lap. The stars were emerging above, one by one like ancient names written across the sky. He thought of the lion's paw, of the pottery wheel, of the wax tablet, now nearly filled, of Samu's weaving, of Silamu's bowl, of the unseen stories carried in simple things. And then, very softly, he played. Just a few notes, not a melody, but a whisper, a breath, a remembering. The city listened. The following morning unfolded like parchment under the sun. No sudden sounds broke its calm, only the quiet clinking of clay vessels being moved in neighboring homes, and the distant calls of herders guiding their animals through narrow alleyways signaled the city's waking breath. And Lilidin opened his eyes to the gentle rhythm of the day. His first thought was not of tasks or lessons. It was of the tile. That fragment, still resting on the shelf, had embedded itself in his thoughts, not for its beauty or age, but for what it represented: continuity, quiet resilience, and the silent voice of forgotten hands. He rose, bathed with a jug of cool water left by Nabzeri, and dressed simply, as always, loose linen bound with a woven belt, the kind that let the air move freely and made no noise when he walked. Downstairs, Nabzeri sat at a low table, carefully inspecting a bundle of reeds tied with string. "These," he said, not looking up, "were gathered from the marshes 2 days ago. Perfect for scribing." Enlilidin joined him, and together, they began preparing the reeds. The process was meditative, cutting, peeling, shaping the nib with small obsidian blades. Neither spoke for some time. They didn't need to. The rhythm of their work spoke for them. Finally, Nabzeri looked up. "Have you thought about what you wish to remember?" The boy paused, then nodded slowly. "Not names, not events. I want to remember how things felt, how they sounded. The way the light touches the wall in the afternoon, the warmth of bread on an open palm, the softness of voices in the temple garden." Nabzeri smiled, the kind of smile that didn't rise quickly but stayed a long time once it came. That is how memory becomes truth. That day's lesson was not in tablets or scrolls. Nabzeri took Enlilidin to a part of the city he had not yet seen. The weaver's quarter, not the market where their finished cloth was sold, but the place where fibers became thread, and thread became pattern. The air there was rich with the scent of dyed wool and the soft, dry rasp of looms at work. Long cords stretched between wooden frames. Women and men moved their hands in smooth, practiced motions, fingers dancing among threads like wind in grass. No one rushed. Every movement mattered. An older woman with deep-set eyes and silver hair tied in a knot greeted them without words. Only a gentle gesture to come closer. Nabzeri bowed slightly, and Enlilidin followed his lead. "This is Tashmichu," Nabzeri said softly. She does not speak aloud. Her hearing is perfect, but her voice was taken by illness many years ago. Yet she teaches more clearly than many who shout. Tashmichu led them to a shaded area where colored yarns hung in bundles: indigo, ochre, crimson, soft brown. She picked up a strand of golden thread and placed it in Enlilidin's hand, then guided his fingers across the taut warp of a nearby loom. The fibers hummed faintly beneath his touch. "She says the thread carries the sound of your fingers." Nabzeri translated, and Enlilidin looked at her with awe. She smiled gently and began weaving again. Every time her shuttle passed, the threads tightened slightly, pulling the pattern into being, row by row, like lines in a story. Enlilidin watched the shapes emerge slowly: waves, leaves, a crescent moon. It was like watching a sentence form, but with color instead of ink. He realized then that a loom was a kind of tablet too, and the weaver, a kind of scribe. As the day waned, Tashmichu handed him a small scrap of cloth, not perfect, but patterned, a beginning. He held it like he would a line of poetry. On the walk home, Nabzeri said, "Not all stories are meant to be read. Some are meant to be worn, or held, or passed hand to hand." That night, back in the quiet of the home, Lillidan laid the cloth next to the tile, the bowl, and the wax tablet, each item different, each one speaking in its own way. He did not write that night. Instead, he lit a second lamp, letting the flames glow side by side, one for the day's memory, one for the thread of all things. As he sat watching the flames sway gently in the hush of night, he heard the echo of the loom's rhythm, the whisper of the tile's glaze, the soft breath of clay being turned, all of it braided together into the silence. He picked up the flute, just once, and played 3 notes. Then he slept. The sounds of the marketplace had long since quieted, leaving behind only the occasional creak of a distant cartwheel and the soft shuffle of sandaled feet returning home. The sky had deepened further into shades of indigo and velvet, with stars beginning to speckle the dome above the city like tiny flames on an endless canopy. The twin moons of Babylon, pale and low on the horizon, cast gentle reflections in the Euphrates as it flowed silently past the outer gardens. Beneath the shaded portico of a modest brick dwelling, near the riverbank, an elder named Nab-Kuduri sat cross-legged, his back straight despite the weight of his years. A soft woolen shawl lay over his shoulders, and his hands rested calmly on his knees as he breathed slowly, evenly, around him. The clay walls of his home still held the warmth of the day, though a cool breeze drifted through the open doorway. The air smelled of burnt myrrh and the subtle sweetness of roasted dates, remnants of the evening meal. His granddaughter, Luma, sat beside him, her head resting gently against his arm. She had asked him to tell her a story, not one from the temple, archives or written in cuneiform on old clay tablets, but one from memory, something personal, something real. Nab-Kuduri had smiled, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening, and had begun to speak. He told her of the days when he, too, had been a child in Babylon, when the streets had been just as dusty, the palms just as tall, and the river just as patient. He spoke of his mother baking flatbreads on hot stones, of how she would hum old songs passed down from her own grandmother. He remembered his father's calloused hands and the way he would carve tiny figures from driftwood for the children to play with. He spoke slowly, each word drawn out like a lullaby, his voice blending with the sound of the wind rustling through reeds at the river's edge. Luma listened quietly, her breath slowing, her eyelids beginning to droop. Outside, fireflies began to flicker in the darkness, dancing between the fig trees like golden embers adrift. A clay lamp burned low beside them, casting an oval of warm light onto the wall, where the shadows of the grandfather and child stretched, long and soft. The silence between his words grew longer now, not from forgetfulness, but from reverence, as if each moment deserved its own space, its own quiet. Within the home, the faint clink of pottery being washed reached their ears, her mother finishing the final chores of the day. The smell of wet clay and river silt mixed gently with the sense of the home, grounding everything in a sense of place, of time. The city beyond their small haven was vast and storied, filled with monuments and gods, but here, in this little corner by the water, it was simply home. When Nab-Kuduri fell silent at last, Luma was already asleep, her breathing soft and even. He looked down at her, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead, and smiled again, though no one saw it. The story had not needed an ending. It lived in her now, stitched into her dreams like threads of gold. Far off in the distance, the ziggurat loomed in silhouette against the night sky, a stairway of shadow reaching up toward the stars. Somewhere near its summit, a lone priest tended to the sacred flame, its glow faint but steady, just as it had always been. And in the quiet, as the city exhaled and the river carried its secrets into the horizon, another night settled gently over ancient Babylon, full of voices, memory, and the stillness of stories waiting to be told. The night deepened, and the hush that followed dusk became more absolute. The homes of Babylon, constructed with sun-baked mud brick and reed-framed windows, now appeared as soft-edged silhouettes under the stars from the rooftops. Faint trails of smoke from extinguished lamps and smoldering incense drifted into the cooler layers of the air, rising above the flat roofs like wisps of thought returning to the heavens. A short distance from the quiet neighborhood where Nab-Kuduri had spoken his last words. For the night, the central courtyard of another modest home still flickered with lamplight. Here, a young scribe named Elushu sat on a low stool, legs wrapped in a light woolen wrap, his wax tablet resting across his lap. Though the day's formal work was done, he often used the nighttime hours for private writing, meditative moments, in which he captured the small details of daily life, meant not for records or kings, but for remembrance. By his side, a small clay jar held reeds for writing, and an oil lamp burned steadily, its tiny flame reflecting in his dark eyes. The amber light lent warmth to the brick walls around him and caused the inscriptions on nearby clay tablets to shimmer faintly. He listened to the faint hum of the city's silence, a distant murmur of river water, the echo of a temple gong, carried on the wind, and the gentle creak of timbers in the ceiling above him adjusting to the night's coolness. He dipped his stylus again, pressing its sharp tip gently into the wax. His writing was slow, not out of laziness but out of respect for the act. He wrote about the day's rhythm, the steady beat of sandals on stone, the laughter of a child who had dropped a fig and watched it roll into the gutter, the way the sky changed hue over the ziggurat at sundown. These were the unnoticed details, the quiet truths of a city that seemed eternal, yet changed with each breath. His sister, Adia, appeared in the doorway, her head wrapped in a soft linen scarf. She carried a small bowl of pomegranate seeds and offered it without a word. Elushu looked up and smiled, grateful. He placed his stylus gently on the table and took a handful, the tart sweetness grounding him in the present moment. They shared the bowl in companionable silence, watching as the lamplight swayed gently in the breeze. Not far from their home, a street dog barked once, sharp and quick, then fell silent again. Somewhere in the city, a baby cried and was comforted. A pair of guards passed by at a distance, their sandals brushing sand, their bronze helmets dull in the moonlight. All of it, the quiet interruptions, the gentle comings and goings, blended into a rhythm that felt ancient and familiar, as though Babylon herself breathed in sleep just like her people. Above, the stars wheeled slowly across the sky, their brightness undisturbed by torchlight or modern noise. Constellations told old stories of Ishtar's journey through the underworld, of E's wisdom and the waters he guarded. The heavens were not just beautiful, they were remembered, named, revered. They watched over Babylon like quiet elders. Elushu leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment. The warmth of the courtyard wall at his back and the soft breeze on his face lulled him into a place between waking and dreaming. In that space, he imagined the city as it had always been, from the days when his ancestors first placed bricks in these lands, through floods and harvests, through kings and commoners. The river flowed beside it, the temples rose above it, and the sky stretched endlessly beyond. He opened his eyes again only when the last of the pomegranate seeds had been eaten. His sister had gone to bed, and the lamp burned lower now, its flame dancing slower, smaller. Elushu blew gently on the wick and watched as the flame curled into itself and disappeared. Darkness settled, soft and full, and he stood, stretching. With a quiet sigh, the wax tablet remained on the stool, the last line still unfinished, as if waiting for tomorrow. He would return, as he always did, to write the rest. And as he stepped inside, drawing the curtain softly behind him, the city around him remained wrapped in its quiet dreaming, a place where time moved gently, voices faded into sleep, and the past remained forever alive in the stillness of the night. Elsewhere in the city, beyond the residential quarters and down a narrow path lined with tamarisk trees, stood one of the many communal gardens tended by both the temple stewards and neighborhood caretakers. By day, the garden was a bustle of quiet activity, elders trimming fragrant herbs, women gathering wild fennel and coriander, and children gently chasing lizards across the warm stone paths. But now, under the cover of night, the garden had become a place of quiet retreat. A gentle breeze stirred the tall grasses, and the papyrus stalks whispered softly to one another. In a shaded corner near a still, square pool lined with cut limestone, an elderly healer named Enata sat cross-legged, her long white shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She held a bundle of dried lavender and thyme, which she occasionally brought close to her nose, inhaling their calming aroma. Her basket beside her was filled with crushed petals and finely powdered roots, all gathered earlier in the day. She wasn't working, not exactly, not at this hour, but tending to her plants and meditating in the moonlight had always brought her peace. This night was no different. A soft golden glow came from the oil lamp resting beside her, casting light onto the surface of the pool, which reflected both the flame and the stars overhead. The pool rippled faintly as a frog leapt in from the edge, its splash muted and gentle. Enata smiled, not startled but amused. Nature's small surprises were part of her evening. The world, she had learned, always whispered its truths in quiet ways. The rustle of leaves, the flutter of an owl's wings overhead, the fragrance of night-blooming jasmine, all spoke a language older than any script pressed into clay. From across the garden, a younger woman approached, Tamar, a new apprentice at the temple who had taken interest in the old ways of healing. She knelt quietly beside the elder without speaking, simply watching for a while. Enata acknowledged her with a soft glance and handed her a sprig of sage. Its leaves curled and soft. Tamar brought it to her nose, closed her eyes, and smiled. "This," she whispered, "smells like the prayer rooms." Enata nodded. "It's the same herb we use to cleanse the air before reciting blessings," she said, her voice low and steady. "Its memory lives in every breath." Together they sat, not needing more words, around them. The garden held its stillness with reverence. Moths flitted lazily around the lamplight. A distant reed flute, perhaps played by a watchman or a sleepless poet, drifted faintly on the wind, its notes lilting and dreamlike dot at the garden's edge. A stone tablet stood propped against a wall, inscribed years ago by a priest who had loved poetry. Its surface was worn, but the final line remained clear. Peace comes not with silence alone, but with the memory of hands that worked with care. Tamar traced her finger across the words. Enata followed her gaze but said nothing. The message had long become part of the garden's soul, as much a part of the plants and soil as the water that nourished them. When the oil in the lamp had burned low, and the frogs had stopped their soft splashes, the two women stood, slow and unrushed. Tamar helped the elder gather her herbs, folding the shawl carefully around her shoulders. They walked together beneath the swaying tamarisk trees, their feet brushing through soft sand, leaving faint impressions that would be gone by morning as they passed under the arched entryway back toward the streets. The city of Babylon slept on. Its walls, so often alive with trade and song and prayer, now held a deeper silence. Not emptiness, but rest. A silence filled with stories, with memory, with the breath of generations who had come before and would come again. The night's hush cradled the city like a lullaby, and the stars above blinked slowly in approval, ancient, watchful, and serene. In the heart of the city, where narrow lanes branched like veins from the great processional way, stood the modest dwelling of a musician named Marduk. By day, his lyre and voice filled the small courtyards and shaded plazas with melodies, both sacred and light-hearted. But it was in the quiet of night that he found the soul of his music. Tonight, the air was particularly soft, the warmth of the day now completely faded, replaced by a gentle coolness that flowed like silk across the stone roads and through the open shutters. Marduk sat beneath a pergola of woven reeds that shaded his rooftop. The stars above seemed unusually bright, and the scent of fig blossoms hung in the still air. Before him rested a lyre carved from dark cedar wood, its strings tuned with practiced care. He plucked them gently, letting each note hum and fade. No audience waited for him. There was no festival or gathering, no ritual that demanded a song. This was music played for the city itself, for the slumbering people, for the gods above, and perhaps for his own wandering thoughts. The notes, soft and wandering, wove into the sounds of the night, the distant call of a night yar, the creaking of a rope swaying from a rooftop pulley, the river's eternal whisper in the background. Marduk often thought that music, more than language, carried the truth of the soul. In the softness of a minor chord or the gentle lifting of a major refrain, one could hear joy, memory, sorrow, hope, even in silence. Tonight's melody was slow and reflective, like a prayer without words. A song that floated upward and disappeared into the darkness like smoke from temple incense. His wife, Lilitham, appeared quietly behind him, her footsteps bare and careful. She carried a folded linen blanket, draping it gently around his shoulders before sitting beside him. They did not speak, and they did not need to. The music was conversation enough. She leaned against him, her head resting lightly on his shoulder. Together they looked out across the rooftops of Babylon. Tiny flames flickered here and there, lanterns in watchtowers, the last of the hearths being banked for the night, or perhaps a priest offering a midnight libation to Sin, god of the moon. The massive silhouette of the ziggurat rose in the distance, dark and powerful, its summit lost in a curtain of stars. "I heard you play this song when our son was born," Lilitham whispered, not expecting a reply. Belmarduk nodded slowly. His fingers continued to brush the strings, the melody shifting into something more wistful, more tender. They sat like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's presence and the music. In the street below, a pair of cats meowed softly to one another before vanishing into the shadows. A jug tipped slightly in a breeze, its clay lip tapping gently against the wall. Not loud enough to disturb, just enough to remind them that the world moved, even now, eventually. The lyre grew quiet. The last note lingered in the air, and then all was still again. They stood, folding the blanket between them, and descended the stairs into their home. The rooftop, empty now, retained the silence like a bowl catching rain, but the music, barely audible, still seemed to echo among the stones and stars, and above, Babylon held it all. The song, the quiet, the love, in its ancient heart, as it always had, and always would dot at the outer edge of the city, where cultivated fields met the beginning of wild lands, and the scent of the Euphrates drifted strongest on the wind. A small cluster of homes nestled against the walls. These were the homes of laborers, of field keepers and water haulers, of those who worked with their hands and rose before the sun. By this hour, their rooms were dark, their beds occupied by tired bodies wrapped in woven blankets. But one figure remained awake. A boy named Dagon sat on a worn reed mat outside his family's home, the doorway behind him covered by a simple linen curtain. He held a smooth stone in one hand and a piece of chalky clay in the other, etching small marks as he copied a symbol he'd seen on a trader's cart earlier in the day. He wasn't supposed to be awake. His mother had already sung her evening blessing and tucked his siblings into the bed they shared. But Dagon's mind was restless. The sky above was mesmerizing, vast and filled with stars that twinkled without urgency. A soft wind rustled the tall barley nearby, making the stalks sway and whisper, as if they were telling stories to one another in a language older than words. From the city walls, the night guard paced slowly, torchlight flickering faintly against mud brick. The occasional clang of a distant gate being secured echoed through the stillness. But nothing stirred near the boy's home. He was alone, not in fear or sadness, but in the kind of peaceful solitude that the night brings only to those who are still growing, still learning how to be part of the world. He etched another mark, mimicking the curve of a glyph he didn't yet understand. To him, the city was full of mysteries, shapes carved into doorways, figures on seals, the symbols scratched into pots, walls, and tablets. He dreamed of knowing what they meant, of reading like the scribes in the palace or the priests in the temples. It wasn't ambition that filled his heart, but a quiet curiosity, a longing to listen to the voices of things left behind. A dog barked softly in the distance, answered by another farther down the street. Somewhere, a jar rolled against the stone in a breeze and came to rest with a hollow sound. The night, though gentle, was not empty. It was filled with murmurs, the language of sleep and time. A voice, gentle and warm, called softly from the doorway behind him. His mother, wrapped in a simple woolen shawl, pushed the curtain aside. "Dagon," she said, not in reprimand but in calm invitation. "The night grows cooler. Come in now." He looked up at her, wide-eyed and still holding his clay and stone. She smiled and opened her arms. "Bring it," she whispered. "You can draw again tomorrow." And so he stood, his limbs sleepy now that his mind had stilled, he walked toward the light inside. Stepping softly across the smoothed earth, the clay tablet he'd marked remained outside. Resting on the reed mat under the starlight, his first silent record left for the night to keep in the quiet that followed. The wind picked up slightly, moving through the fields like a breath. Babylon, even at its edge, seemed to sigh contentedly in sleep. The stars above continued their slow arc, distant and eternal. The boy's tablet glinted faintly before the light faded, and again, the city returned to its hush, a peaceful hush that stretched from the tallest ziggurat to the smallest room, holding every story, every dream, gently in its arms, farther toward the temple quarter, where the streets widened slightly and the air held a faint trace of incense and polished bronze. The towering presence of Isagila, the temple dedicated to Marduk, cast its quiet shadow over the surrounding buildings. Though its ceremonies had ended hours ago, the sacred energy of the space lingered like a fragrance, woven into the very stone. Acolytes had long since retired to their dormitories, and the last of the sacred fires had been fed for the night. Only the high priest's assistant, a soft-spoken man named Adria, remained in the inner courtyard, seated upon a low bench beside a carved basin filled with water and lotus petals. He often came here after prayers were complete, after the chanting had faded into the vaults and the bell had sounded its final chime. This was his moment of reflection, a space between the duties of the day and the silence of sleep. He found comfort in the stillness of the sacred courtyard, in the cool feel of the stone beneath his feet, in the delicate scent of the temple gardens just beyond the walls. Above him, the temple's stone colonnades reached upward like fingers toward the heavens, and through the open courtyard, he could see the stars clearly, unclouded, brilliant, and unblinking. The moon had risen higher now, pale and watchful, its light diffused by the whitewashed plaster of the temple walls. The ziggurat beyond stood like a mountain etched in silver, layered in tiers, each level a symbol of man's reaching toward the divine. Adria had grown up in the temple, not born into priesthood, but offered as a boy by his family for the sacred training. Years of careful service had taught him reverence, humility, and the beauty of rhythm, in rituals, in writing, in the very structure of life. And though many imagined the priesthood as filled with mystery and awe, it was the gentlest acts, lighting a lamp, sweeping the floor, placing a reed mat just so, that brought him the most peace. Now, he dipped his fingers into the basin and stirred the water lightly, watching the lotus petals swirl and return to stillness. He whispered a prayer under his breath, not in the full ceremonial voice, but in the language of closeness. It was a prayer of thanks and of protection for the temple, for the people, for the dreams that would pass through the night like silent barges down the river. In the distant chambers, the statue of Marduk sat enshrined in golden calm, its gaze unknowable, its presence eternal. To Adria, the god was not only in the statue, but in the wind that cooled his face, in the sound of water dripping gently from the eaves, and in the deep quiet that followed true devotion. A soft footfall approached, one of the elder temple women, bringing a folded linen for his shoulders. She placed it without a word and returned to her quarters. Adria closed his eyes for a moment, grateful for the silent care. When he opened them again, he remained still, simply watching the moonlight move slowly across the stone floor. The temple was sleeping, and so too would he soon, but not before. Offering one last prayer, not aloud, not even in words, just in breath, above him. A breeze moved gently through the courtyard, rustling the sacred palm leaves and carrying the perfume of lotus and cedarwood into the night. And so, even here, at the heart of the holy, Babylon exhaled gently, and the world remained at peace. Beyond the temple quarter and the quiet gardens, past the rooftops where musicians strummed and the courtyards where potters, scribes, and families had slowly faded into rest, the Euphrates flowed, slow, dark, and eternal. Its surface reflected the moon like a ribbon of liquid silver winding through the sleeping land. Here on the riverbank, where reeds whispered and frogs chirped softly, an old ferryman named Zabdanu guided his empty boat with slow strokes toward the dock. The day's work had long since ended. No more passengers to carry, no more goods to haul across the current. But still he drifted, content to let the motion of the water rock his thoughts into silence. The ferry boat creaked gently, worn by years of service and polished smooth by hundreds of barefooted steps. The oars dipped with a rhythm like breathing, in, out, in, out. Zabdanu had spent his life on this river. He knew its moods like one might know a spouse's voice or a child's laughter. He could tell when rain was coming from the way the air shifted, and he knew where the fish slept when the tide was low. Tonight, the river was calm, not entirely still, but deeply at peace. He let the boat glide for a while, hands resting lightly on the tiller. In the distance, the city shimmered faintly in the moonlight. Even in sleep, Babylon looked proud, her walls majestic, her towers stretching upward, her ziggurat rising like a mountain shaped by memory. Torchlight dotted the top of the gate towers, unmoving, steady. The sounds of the city had all but vanished, replaced by the gentle chorus of night. As he pulled gently toward the dock, the ropes coiled and familiar, Zabdanu heard the low hoot of an owl echo through the trees lining the water. A heron lifted from the shallows, its wings wide and slow, casting a fleeting shadow across the moonlit current. The river, too, had its keepers, not all of them human. He tied off the boat with practiced hands and stepped onto the bank, his sandals pressing into the soft mud. At his small riverside shelter, a lantern flickered low, and his old dog lifted its head, tail wagging slowly in recognition. No words were needed. Zabdanu knelt beside the dog, scratched behind its ears, and looked back once more at the water dot behind him. The city exhaled. Every corner, every home, every temple and alley held lives in rest. Sleep had taken them not in haste, but with care, gently, like the river that carried dreams. He whispered a soft blessing, one he'd heard from a priest long ago but had made his own. May your rest be as long as the stars are high, and your breath as steady as the tide. Then he stepped inside, closing the reed mat behind him, and the night, now deep and full, held all of Babylon in a cradle of stillness above the rooftops. The moon continued its silent watch. Below, in the streets and fields, in courtyards and rooms, every soul, farmer, scribe, mother, potter, priest, child, lay wrapped in quiet. The city slept, and in its sleep, it remembered, and in its memory, it dreamed. The past did not vanish, it whispered. It sang in stone and reed, in water and wind, in stories like these, soft, slow, and everlasting. And so, dear listener, as we leave the peaceful night of ancient Babylon behind, let the calm and stillness of that world stay with you. Perhaps, as you drift into your own dreams, you carry with you the scent of temple incense, the sound of a lyre beneath the stars, or the hush of reeds beside the Euphrates. If you found comfort in this journey through time, we invite you to join us again. Like, subscribe, and share with others who seek rest wrapped in history. Your support brings new stories to life, softly, gently, night after night. Until next time, sleep well.